This afternoon I'd like to present my research, Open and Closed, a Wesleyan Reflection on Christian Narratives of Love. I'm a bit surprised that in the end it ends up being a Wesleyan reflection. That wasn't my intent, but that was the end result, and I'm very, very glad for that today. This research project engages with a critique made by Jean-François Lyotard. He criticizes the Christian narrative as being an oppressive, hegemonic master narrative which conquered all the narratives in Rome and dominated Western culture for centuries. Lyotard maintains that the Christian master narrative links all phrases together under a rule of love. This allows it to link to any and every event. When we were in Rome, we saw that literally they took the marble from the Forum, the Roman spot, and took it up to the Vatican to build the Vatican. So literally taking over the narratives of Rome. In a postmodern context, this identification of Christianity as a grand narrative is problematic for theology, for precisely such oppressive meta-narratives are rejected in this context. However, Lyotard sensitizes theology to the fact that a Christian narrative can easily forget the dispute that erupts at the presentation of any phrase. This dispute Lyotard calls a différent. A différent is a situation where two parties are in conflict, where there is no rule that can regulate their dispute, and where one party is forced to express him or herself in an idiom that does not signify the wrong done to that person. I couldn't possibly explain Lyotard's phrase mechanics as he analyzes it in his book, The Différent, in so short a space. However, the most important finding is this. Lyotard identifies the narrative genre as the one which most easily forgets this dispute, or différent, disregards the otherness of any event, and incorporates any phrase into its narrative by linking phrases according to a before-after time scheme. So phrase, 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 linked in a story, before, after, before, after, before, after. A grand narrative presumes that it can reveal the meaning of all little stories. Grand narratives make universal claims, and they universalize the instances within phrase universes. For example, addresser, addressee, sense, and referent. So this afternoon I am an addresser addressing you, the addressees, and I'm talking about Lyotard's phrase philosophy. That's the referent I'm talking about. And in interpreting that, then I am providing a meaning for that. And he says that in any conversation, these four instances are situated in the various phrases. Grand narratives are told by a universal addresser who stands outside of and above the narrative. They often make universal claims about humanity rather than speaking about individual people. Lyotard finds the grand narrative insidious, for it totalizes history or presents a project for humanity which denies the witness to the event present in the presenting of a phrase. This it does through a rule, an idea, which governs the linking of every phrase. Lyotard calls this propensity for forcing the linking of all phrases according to a rule evil. One easily sees what Lyotard fears when one considers the Nazi rule of linking all phrases and gestures together according to the rule of pure Aryan blood, or the Stalinist rule of linkings according to the rule of the workers' paradise, ending in Auschwitz and the gulags respectively, for those who resisted these grand narratives. Since Lyotard criticizes Christianity as oppressing the other through love, it's important to understand how Lyotard thinks love. Very little has been written on this subject. One of the key findings of my research is to figure out Lyotard's view of love. Namely, he views love in terms either of representation or presentation. One loves another as a representation when one observes and manipulates the other as an idea. Or one loves the other as he, she, it presents himself, herself, itself in a moment of an absolute now where the lover becomes lost in the wonder of the other. Those lovers in the throes of love experience love as presentation, And this clearly is the function Lyotard prefers. Lyotard says that they strive for language, they babble. You hear lovers chat. That's nonsense, but they're trying to express the wonder of this love that they're experiencing. Since in love as representation, the beloved is reduced to an idea with the goal of understanding and consuming the other. Thus, a danger for Christian theology is forgetting that we often deal with love as an idea. Such an idea can be used to silence the other, even destroying her body in flames out of love for the church. For example, Joan of Arc. Lyotard's thinking confronts theology with a critical consciousness of how narratives forget alterity or otherness. He identifies the way in which the Christian grand narrative regulates the linking of phrases, namely through a rule of love. Christians love whatever occurs as if it is a gift from God. This allows the Christian narrative to embrace any phrase, event, or gesture, thereby incorporating its disruptive power into its own story. After all, Christians are commanded by God to love even their enemies. In view of Lyotard's criticism, the question arises, how should theology engage with this critique? Lyotard has hardly received a reception from theology. Publications usually quote his three-word assessment of the postmodern condition as being one of, quote, incredulity toward meta-narratives, end of quote. Thereafter, he is largely ignored. The radical Orthodox theologian K.A. Smith has written about Lyotard in a cursory manner in his book, Who's Afraid of Postmodernism?, taking Derrida, Lyotard, and Foucault to church. However, as Professor Buffa mentions in his recent book, hardly any journal article or book addresses Lyotard's relation to Christianity. Buffa holds this field almost entirely to himself. Our beloved dean. Leuven Buffa receives Lyotard's philosophical critique and makes it fruitful for theology. Buffa allows Lyotard to confront Christianity as a critical consciousness arising from outside of the borders of the Christian narrative. This experience comes as an interruption of the too automatically made linking of phrases. Theology, therefore, is confronted with a critique from without, while it is also invited to confront itself from within its own narrative, for its own benefit. From without, theology learns how the narrative genre tends to collapse in upon itself, thereby setting up a rigid border which establishes an inside and an outside to the Christian story. Those who are inside are the saints, the faithful, while those on the outside are heretics. Lyotard's critique also allows theology to confront itself from within its own story. Buffa does this, and the fruit thereof is his model of the open narrative. Yeah. Well, I like the fact that the circle's open as well. It's not completely closed. Buffa notes that Lyotard calls philosophy to the task of, quote, bearing witness to the different, or the dispute. That is, to strive to acknowledge otherness, to remember that at the linking of every phrase there is a dispute. Buffa identifies Lyotard's differential thought as an example of philosophy functioning as an open narrative, as striving to bear witness to alterity, or otherness. This leads Buffa to ask if there are other discourses which also intentionally strive to remain open to otherness. Out of this confrontation with Lyotard's critical analysis, Buffa develops his model of the open narrative. An open narrative is one that pays particular attention to the other's irreducible alterity and witnesses thereto. It refuses to take the observer's position, realizing in agreement with Lyotard that the grand narrative attempts to reveal the truth in all small narratives and phrases by universalizing the instances situated within any phrase. That is, the addresser, the addressee, the referent, and the sense becomes the universal addresser, the universal addressee, and so on. Rather, an open narrative resists the objective situating of the self as observer as a means of extracting the meaning of all gestures, phrases, and narratives, through a cognitive or scientific apparatus. Buffa writes in the open narrative, quote, "There are no observers anymore, only participants," end of quote. Buffa argues that the Christian narrative is best understood as an open narrative, a narrative that recognizes its particularity while witnessing to the grace of God's interrupting love. In place of exclusively trying to define the truth as the truth content of our narrative, we are spurred on to live in and give witness to the truth that ultimately transcends our particular Christian narrative through the interruption of the other. The Christian open narrative is a story of love, a love that refuses to prematurely close itself off from the other, a love involved in the inexpressible hidden in the very presentation of the other. For Buffa, the Jesus narrative is an open narrative par excellence. Two critiques can be made of Buffa's work. The first is that he has not offered a border either for the Christian narrative of love or love itself. A story without a border is no narrative. A second criticism of Buffa is that he receives the Kantian side of Lyotard's work, but not his libidinal or sophist side. Lyotard prefers love as presentation to representation. That is, he emphasizes the experience of encountering the lover as something that is unpresentable to reason. However, this tends to be left out of Buffa's work. Buffa leans toward the rational, relegating the encounter of love to a more rational concept of interruption. Lyotard properly identifies the Christian narrative as a story of love. Therefore, the way that theologians think and speak about love becomes crucial for a theological reflection on the Christian narrative. Four recent theologians offer various views on love. Andres Nigren argues that only God can love agapeically, that God literally pours love into our hearts, for we are incapable of loving with agape love. However, James Moffat maintains that we can and must love God, neighbor, and self. This is our moral obligation. Leon Morris offers a word study which elaborates the various biblical expressions of love without reducing love to one or two ideas. These three Protestant theologians reflect on love beginning with redemption. However, Werner Jean-Rond begins with creation and thinks about the phenomenology of love, exploring love's possibilities. Jean-Rond stresses love as God's gift to humanity, reflected in networks of love. However, Jean-Rond pays insufficient attention to the limits of love while portraying holiness in largely negative terms, as a human form of abusing one's body. A short survey of theologians shows that love is often reflected on apart from holiness. This is striking, particularly since God reveals God's self as both holy and love. Thinking the limits of love is important, since Lyotard sensitizes theology to the possibility of an abusive love, which represents the beloved to itself. In order to think the relationship of love and holiness, we turn to the idea of a holy love in John Wesley's theology. John Wesley was a highly influential Anglican priest who led the great Methodist movement in England in the 18th century. He places sanctification at the heart of his theology, and he contends that a true love for God and neighbor is the end of salvation. Through grace provided by the Holy Spirit, the human individual is able to love God, neighbor, and self. Holiness is understood to be the expression of God's character, which is written on the human heart. Those who are entirely sanctified are perfected in love. This sanctification is the manner in which God restores the imago Dei to the human soul. However, Randy Maddox reads Wesley's thought to mean that God's grace restores to the human individual both the ability to respond to God's person and law, as well as a responsibility to do so. Maddox calls this responsible grace. Grace, or the event of grace, as Buffa calls it, enables a person to enter into God's kingdom of love, but doesn't force one to do so. Wesley's theological program allows us to conceive of a border for a Christian open narrative of love, where God's love is seen as radically open to sinners, to those who do not deserve love. God's redemptive activity, experienced humanly as grace, invites individuals to participate in God's narrative of love. At the same time, God's holiness forms a porous border, expressing God's radical opposition to the sinful as that which destroys God's beloved. Redemptive grace provides a way for those who choose to repent and enter into God's project of love. According to this model, holiness protects the individual irreducible alterity while simultaneously safeguarding God's radical otherness. God respects the creature, while the human must respect God's abhorrence of sin. This model, therefore, proposes a love story in which its border is both radically open to the other while radically closed to sin. In a word, porous. Thank you.
Thank you, dear candidate, for this clear presentation with beautiful PowerPoint, support of the main lines of your work. I would first of all make a small interruption, if I may. It's a bit. It's maybe a bit awkward to do so, but apparently also since you speak about your topic, I think maybe it would be good to do justice for a moment to the memory of a person of Professor Boeve's research group who has passed away yesterday. It's Dr. Stefan Stofanik, who passed away yesterday morning in a car accident in Slovenia. Maybe we should stand up for a brief moment and do justice because he was known to many of us here. Thank you. I think now we are even better prepared to continue this defense and first give the floor to proud promoter, Professor Boeve.
Dear promovendus, dear Phil, dear Becky, ladies and gentlemen, who would have imagined that we would stand here in this room some 7 years after you, at the age of 47, married and father of 4 children, applied to our faculty to be accepted in our Master of Advanced Studies program in order to continue afterwards with doctoral studies. Who could have imagined that a senior pastor and missionary of the Wesleyan Church, after having spent half of his life as a pastor in the United States and as a missionary in Suriname, would stand here to receive a doctorate from the Catholic University of Leuven? Who would have thought some 54 years ago in the region of Sonoma, California, that the newborn Philip Davis would study French postmodern thought in order to reflect on love and holiness? I still remember the first time that Phil entered my office. It was still in the library, and he announced to me that he was sent by God to make a doctorate with me. as a missionary with a special interest in Eastern Europe and hereto instructed by the missions agency Global Partners of the Wesleyan Church, he wanted to get to know the heart of Europe's mentality in order to become a missionary to Europe and to train other missionaries to Europe to become so. I still recall that I was a bit surprised, even speechless, something which hardly happened before, because I never had God sending people directly to me, or at least nobody so far told me that. Moreover, as a Roman Catholic theologian accentuating the importance of sacramentality, mediation, and hermeneutics, I was at unease with this bold statement. And I think I answered the question with the following response, but you have to correct me if that is, at least in my memory, I answered the question with the following response. Mr. Davis, if you really want to work with me, you will have to learn that God does not speak to people directly, but that God's revelation to us is historically, contextually mediated.
Something like that.
Yes? I'm quite sure that he did not believe me at the time. I don't know whether he believes me now. But at the same time, it did not frighten him enough to chase him away from my office. On the contrary, he inquired anyway how he could fulfill his mission to become acquainted with Europe's mentality in order to proclaim the gospel to Europe. And he was so persistent that after a while I said, well, if you really want to know about Europe's postmodern mentality, then study the postmodern thinker par excellence, Jean-François Lyotard, and look at his criticism of Christianity. Knowing that Phil was not very well philosophically trained, he studied biblical theology in the Azusa Pacific University and at Fuller Seminary. I thought this would do the trick to get him out. But again, he did not leave, but started reading and rereading and listening again the important works of Jean-François Lyotard time and again. Of course, there was also a methodological concern behind my proposal. I had encountered too many theologians, especially from the Protestant traditions, who used the postmodern criticism in a first phase to discredit European modern rationality, in order then, in a second phase, to bring in massively in view the Christian narrative, as if the criticism, the postmodern criticism, would not pertain to the Christian narrative as well. J.B. Smith's book, and you mentioned it already, Who is Afraid of Postmodernism, bringing Derrida, Lyotard, and Foucault to church, is only one example thereof. That was also the reason why my request to Phil was not only to read Lyotard, but also to prove him right in his criticism of Christianity as the master narrative of God. And that's why Phil, for instance, investigated witch trials. The trial of Joan of Arc only being one example. And only afterwards, after having taken this criticism to heart, to start theologizing again in conversation with Lyotard. And very remarkably, Phil took up this chapter. And the work we have here in front of us is the result of this brave undertaking. However, Phil did not only study Lyotard, dealing with Lyotard's criticism to Christianity and criticizing Lyotard from the part of Christianity with regard to the idea of love and the Christian narrative. He did more than that, and so doing took revenge for my initiative to confront him with the difficulties of reading Lyotard. He also started reading critically the work of his own promoter, applying it to the same methodology, appreciating what he had to say, but also criticizing and correcting him where he deemed it necessary. Especially also in order to receive a more thick description of what a Christian narrative of love should be, complementing the idea of love in a throughout Wesleyan fashion with the idea of holiness. It should be clear. This dissertation is a real accomplishment on the part of its author. Sent to Leuven in order to study the postmodern condition, in order to prepare himself to be a missionary in Europe, our candidate has engaged himself in a careful study of one of the most prominent postmodern philosophers, also one of the most difficult postmodern philosophers, and following the work of his promoter, investigated the potential of a Christian faith understood as an open narrative of love, in contradistinction with Lyotard's evaluation of Christianity as a hegemonic master narrative of love. Here too, our candidate not only performs a close reading of Lyotard's seminal work, and you read it in French, but also tests the latter's theory. He tries to prove Lyotard's point by giving examples of the Christian understanding of love as hegemonic. His work on Lyotard in this regard is broader, and Phil mentioned it, than the work I did before, not only because it also includes the writings of Lyotard before 1979, so before La Commission Postmoderne, but also because he chooses to tackle other themes and discussions to explain what Lyotard is about in his writings. Next to this, our candidate has to be commended for the depth with which he has read and elaborated on the very specific texts of Lyotard, such as Le Différent and so on. Also the various diagrams, and we still have one here, the various diagrams he offers in the dissertation help the reader to follow his arguments. His rendering of the theological evaluation and the elaboration by his promoter of Lyotard's approach and criticism of Christianity, I think, is faithful to the work of the promoter. Of course, I'm not the best person to judge, I think, while at the same time critical. At the same time, Phil, you chose to further engage the idea of the Christian narrative as an open narrative of the idea of love, and you studied, as we mentioned, the most prominent theologies of love of the 20th century, Nigel, Moffat, Morris, and then 21st century Jean Rome, who in his book offers an overview of much more theologies of love, which you engaged as well. The last chapter brings down an element which stems from your own particular Wesleyan tradition and focuses on holiness. As a matter of fact, you mentioned it yourself, it was not planned, but it quite naturally went into that. So I mentioned in a private conversation to the first corrector today also that for me the dissertation was finished after Jean Rome, but yeah, there was a drive in order to have that last chapter as well, and I think if we read the dissertation now, indeed, the dissertation would not be what it is without that last chapter. All in all, this is a very, very, very decent work in theology, with which you, as far as I'm concerned, have proven to be a worthy candidate to be promoted a doctorate in theology of KU Leuven. That's only, of course, my opinion. With this dissertation, Phil, you have proven that you indeed have learned to do theology the Leuven way, contextual hermeneutically, critical constructively, fundamental theology in dialogue with contemporary philosophy and theology, without, however, losing touch with your own theological Wesleyan tradition. And it should be said, precisely because you had to familiarize yourself with this Leuven way, you also helped the Leuven researchers to question their own presuppositions. This holds, of course, true for this promoter who was now and then confronted with a researcher questioning logically sound, creative in its construction, honest in its presentation of authors, moderate in its evaluation, critical constructive in its furthering the discourse, reconstructive towards your particular tradition, innovative in its outcome. And above all, you also published on Saint Lyotard the article, and you gave papers, among others, in Santa Barbara and Cambridge, so I really think you really invested in academically becoming what you are, a scholar in postmodern theology. Before concluding, I also would like to express my gratitude to you because of the services you performed for this faculty and the research group Theology in a Postmodern Context. Both as a job student in the time you were a self-supporting student, but also during the last 2 years as an assistant, you did numerous translations from Dutch to English and edited texts, both policy documents for the dean, as well as theological text for your promoter. Thank you very much for that. For all of this, Phil, my sincere congratulations to you, also to Becky, other family members, with the completion of this fine piece of work. My work as a promoter is done now. It is, however, with confidence that I now deliver you into the hands of this jury. Because I know that this work for you was not only an academic exercise, but also a personal struggle, a personal attempt to come to terms with what the Christian narrative of holy love could be today. And in this respect, I would add, God was right to send you to this.
Thank you. Is there anything you have to add or comment to this?
This is very un-European, but it's very American. I love this man. And I believe 100% in what he's doing. And I'm so grateful to have spent 7 years with him.
Well, I hope at this defense you will be able to say the same thing about your correctors. And, well, you have been blessed by 3 correctors who have read your work with a positive approach, but at the same time will deal or will apply to you the same criticism as you have applied to your promoters and other people's works. So I'm happy to introduce to all of you as the first corrector Professor Chris Bounds. And Professor Bounds has quite some things in similar with our candidate, because before he turned to academia, he also worked, as we say in Dutch, on the field as a pastor. And then in 2002 he became appointed to Indiana Wesleyan University, where he teaches systematic and evangelical theology and society. He has published a lot in journals like the Asbury Theological Journal and the Expository Times, not to mention the East West Church and Ministry Report and the Catalyst. Numerous articles, chapters, and several books. And for a dissertation on Wesleyan theology and postmodernism, he was really the person to ask. We're happy that he can be present here and enter in conversation with our candidate. Professor Bounds, you have
I certainly appreciate the opportunity that's been given to me to interact with Phil Davis's dissertation. And I want to begin by applauding the fine work that has been done by Mr. Davis and the contribution that he has specifically made to Wesleyan holiness theology. The Wesleyan holiness theological tradition has only begun to grapple seriously with the critiques of Christianity offered by postmodern philosophers. Unfortunately, as recognized by Mr. Davis, the Wesleyan holiness work that has been done has been plagued by unsympathetic readings of the postmodern philosophers, or very limited readings of the postmodern philosophers. And Mr. Davis's dissertation addresses well both of these Wesleyan holiness deficiencies. His work represents the most serious Wesleyan holiness engagement of a postmodern philosopher, Lyotard, and constructively appropriates Lyotard's critique of Christianity's grand narrative of love through Professor Bouvet's Christian Open Narrative and John Wesley's Theology of Holy Love. With my acknowledgement of his fine work, I'd like to take a few moments and point out what I believe are some strengths and some weaknesses in his dissertation from a Wesleyan holiness perspective. Let me begin with 2 of his strengths. First, John Wesley repeatedly used throughout his writings the phrase holy love, and believed that holy and love must go together. Holy brings to the phrase holy love what love alone does not. Holiness represents for Wesley a qualitative designation that reveals the integrity and the beauty of the relations of love. As Professor Ken Collins has stated, quote, "Love apart from holiness is soft, naively wishful, and likely self-indulgent. Holiness, apart from love, is a consuming fire. End of quote. Mr. Davis' work captures Wesley well with his development of holiness as the porous border of love. Mr. Davis' work is the best, most detailed work of this subject I've read. And his work is a corrective to some contemporary Wesleyan holiness theologians like Thomas Ord and Michael Lodall, who want to reduce holiness simply to love. Mr. Davis is correct. Quote, love must set up a border to protect the alterity of both parties, protecting the individuality of each person in the love relationship. End of quote. Second, Mr. Davis's appropriation of Leotard through Professor Bouvet's open narrative provides a necessary critique of the excesses of the Wesleyan holiness tradition of which Mr. Davis is a part, where we have fallen victim to a master narrative, a hegemonic narrative, and have been more focused on the idea of holiness through our legalism and articulation of a master narrative than an open narrative of love with focus on a real encounter with God to experience an actual event of grace. Those are two significant strengths of the dissertation. Now, weaknesses. First, let me acknowledge that Mr. Davis's presentation of Wesley represents, well, a particular reading of Wesley that is associated with Duke University professor Randy Maddox, he mentioned earlier. These particular lines of interpretation include a more Eastern Orthodox reading of Wesley, the focus on progressive sanctification towards Christian perfection as maturity, and new birth as a struggle with the power of sin and not deliverance from the power of sin. It is important to note that there are other Wesleyan interpretations of these issues. And I personally follow another interpretive line than Maddox and Davis on these issues. I would like to have seen more engagement on interpretations here in his dissertation, at least in his footnotes. Up to this point, Mr. Davis's work has primarily been his close reading and interpretation of the primary text. It's one of the things I love about this dissertation, is a sympathetic, close reading of the primary sources. However, in his treatment of Wesley, it appears to me to be less a close reading of Wesley's writings and more of a reliance upon a limited number of secondary sources. However, this does not impact the overall thrust of Mr. Davis's thesis, but a minor methodological observation here. Second, there is a minor factual error regarding Wesley. First, on page 328, Mr. Davis makes a claim regarding Wesley's amendment of the Anglican Articles of Religion on Original Sin. He states that the amendment made by Wesley amends the Anglican article to read, quote, very far gone from original righteousness, end of quote. Mr. Davis argues that Wesley was concerned about making room for a human response to grace in the corrupted but not destroyed natural image. However, what is quoted is actually straight from the Anglican article. The actual amendment Wesley made here was to strike the clause, quote, it deserveth God's wrath and punishment, end of quote. Wesley's edit here was regarding the guilt of original sin and not the issue of free will. Third, I believe a weak area in Mr. Davis's work is his treatment of Wesley as an open theologian. The primary example used for Wesley being at least an open theologian is his relationship to Roman Catholics. However, I believe that there is more fertile ground for exploration in Wesley's understanding of prevenient grace in other religions. I should pause here and simply say this. Actually, I agree that Wesley, I think, can be used as a model and can be used as an example of someone who moves towards being an open theologian. I just disagree with the particular example that he uses. And this is in regard to the Roman Catholic Church. Although I don't disagree, I just think there are better examples in Wesley than his engagement with Roman Catholics. And I believe that there are two areas that I believe show better and illustrate what Mr. Davis wants to do. First is John Wesley's understanding of prevenient grace operating in other religions. Wesley is very open and recognizes that there are events of grace that happen in and through other religions, for people who've never had an opportunity to hear the gospel. And Wesley, especially the later Wesley, is very open to the possibility that prevenient grace can become saving grace in and through Christ Jesus. And so that it's quite possible that there are people who will be in heaven who never confessed Christ in this life. And then second, another area which I believe would be fertile ground for exploration here is Wesley's abhorrence of the closed meta-narrative of Calvinism, particularly in regard to the doctrine of predestination, in which the Reformed teaching believes that God only elects certain people to salvation and elects other people to damnation. So there are people who, by God's arbitrary decree, or I should say sovereign decree, not arbitrary, sovereign decree, who never have an opportunity for salvation. And also through the Reformed traditions, emphasis on limited versus unlimited atonement. Well, again, those are at least some areas that stood out for me in the dissertation. Overall, I found the dissertation to be very helpful, and it holds great promise in what it can speak to the American Protestant evangelical context, as well as our Wesleyan holiness context.
Do you have a question?
I do. I do. I'd like to begin, and in many ways this is a softball question. It's a softball question. I'm just interested because it's not quite clear in your dissertation. And that is, Wesley teaches that Christian perfection is about a restoration of what humanity lost in the garden. And the way that you present Wesley, and the way that you talk about this, of course, is the restoration of the image of God. So one of the things I would be interested in hearing from you is, from a Wesleyan perspective, what is the difference between Adamic perfection, the perfection that Adam and Eve had in the garden before the fall, and Christian perfection? Is there a distinction between the two? And if there is, what is that distinction?
Wesley's understanding of Adamic perfection was that Adam was created with the ability to obey God's will, almost automatically, in his moral character, in his political image, and so on. Wesley teaches that Adamic perfection has been lost through sin. And not simply, as I understand it, not simply through Adam's sin, but through each individual's choice to sin, once they come to the point of realizing what the consequences are, what the responsibilities are, and not carrying through. That Adamic perfection then is lost. But as I understand from my reading of Wesley is saying that this pure love for God can be restored. It then becomes a Christian perfection, but it comes through the realization of the grace of God, what God has done for us, participating in the light that God has given us, and then God sovereignly working in the person's heart. And I know that as I present Maddox, you might have noticed that when I get to entire sanctification, I veer away from Maddox and I turn to other people.
Go for Wynkoop.
Yeah, I go to Wynkoop. And because I lean more toward the idea that God does do a sovereign work at that moment, that justification is a work of God, and no matter how much we participate, we cannot work ourselves. But I also have sympathy with what Maddox is saying, that we have to participate in some fashion with the grace that God's given, whether it's convicting grace or, well, the grace that God puts before the person. And so Adamic perfection is not something that's possible for us, as I understand it, but Christian perfection is.
And what would you say is the basic difference between the two? I'm not sure that I've heard.
Well, I'm struggling a little bit to find the direction, but Adamic perfection flows out of creation, whereas Christian perfection then flows out of redemption. And I see these two as being very important to hold together. And I see that these two theologians tend to go in one direction, or they tend to go in the other, but they don't tend to hold them together in tension.
You do that very well. I hope that you will continue to develop that thought in regard to keeping those two in tension. If I can go on to a second question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, well, I in fact saw this very thing happening at the last SST meeting at the University of Durham. And maybe I shouldn't bring this up because it goes in a direction I really don't want to go in. Maybe I shouldn't tell you I don't want to go in that direction. But someone talking about queer theology, and it was continually love, 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 love. In fact, Professor DeMay will like this. Maybe he won't. It quoted the end of Jean Ron's book, A Theology of Love, an extended quote to kind of nail the last nail in the coffin of the argument the person was making. And I wanted to stand up and say, but don't you realize precisely that Jean Ron at this point is going completely to love, and he is not holding sin or holiness at all in the conversation. And yet he specifically said, I'm going to use him as an authority that you all know and respect. And there it was like, we're going to go right to love and forget holiness. On the other hand, you can go to holiness and you forget love, and you run into all kinds of other problems. I see those two as necessarily.
Another thing, I never really saw a paragraph that defines succinctly what holiness and love are.
Okay.
And so I would be interested in how you would succinctly define holiness and how you would succinctly define love. You give great attention to these, and it's there, but I would be interested in a succinct definition.
Holiness is the character of God. It's God's character. It's how God views life, love, humans, relationships, the proper ordering of things. It's God's opinion, which is reflected out of who God is as a triune being. It's the character of God. And God wants that character then to be restored within a human individual.
And then that relationship to love.
Well, I think you said it, where you talked about love without holiness. I would say it a little bit differently. It becomes tolerance or it becomes indifference. If you love someone but there's nothing at stake, then it doesn't matter what they do. So you can become actually quite indifferent. You allow whatever, but you're indifferent. I think that if you have holiness without love, then as you said, it's consuming fire. And you have to have those two together. Because I love my wife, I care very deeply that her love and my love is only for each other and not shared with anyone else. So I care about the character of that love relationship. But at the same time, if it's only I'm going to consume and hold her, or she's going to consume and hold me as an object, then there's no love there. And that becomes warped as well. For me, because God is love, then love is holy, or is holiness. And holiness is love because God says on the one hand, I'm holy, I'm love. And those two, they're not opposed. They belong together.
One final burning question.
Yeah, one last question. I would be interested in hearing your response to Wesley's sort of rejection and his critique of Calvinism, especially in regard to this idea of an open narrative. Do you think that his vehement opposition to Calvinism fits within the sort of open narrative?
Well, the problem, of course, with Calvin, and actually my systematic theologian at Fuller that I studied 3 years with was an Edwardian Calvinist. So Jonathan Edwards says that in his Freedom of the Will treatise, he's talking about freedom of the will all the way through, 300 pages. You get to the end, he says, basically, we have no freedom of the will because it's cause, effect, cause, effect, cause, effect, and God made the first move, and so therefore you are what you are because of the motion God set into motion, so we have no freedom of the will. Which is really very logical if you're going to go for a predestination view, which leads naturally to double predestination, which leads to God then as, I would say, as monster. He creates billions of people, only a small number have any possibility of being saved, and only because God chose those individuals. The rest are created for hell forever, and they have no say in the matter. To me, that becomes God as monster. And Wesley passionately believed that the gospel was for everyone, that God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And that's why I see Wesley more in the lines of an open narrative, where he would say, come. In fact, not only would he say that, but he would change his method of preaching, he'd change the music, he'd change the structure of the societies and so on. He'd do everything that he could that at times offended even his own sensibility, but he was willing to break out of forms and constrictions to try and bring people in.
Thank you. Thank you. As a second corrector, we have Dr. Yuri Schrijvers. Dr. Yuri Schrijvers works as a postdoctoral researcher, took his PhD with Professor Boone in 2006, working at the crossroads of philosophy and theology, working on authors like Jean-Luc Marion, Emmanuel Levinas, Jean-Yves Lacoste, publishes a lot on postmodern theology, and he seemed to be a very good second corrector. Dr. Schreiber,
Thank you.
you have the floor.
Hi, Phil. Please excuse me if I remain seated. My knee is still paining me some days. First of all, congratulations. This is a very nice work. I love reading it. Still have fond memories of my time with your work. Colleague has said there's a lot of hope in the thesis. Certain kindness as well, I would say. Humor, I still recall the footnote on Stephen Hawking where he says that I may have understood the cosmos, but women remain a mystery for me. I must say, afterwards I thought, for me the situation is even worse. Women remain a mystery for me, and I didn't even understand the cosmos. But basically, I love your work.
Well, and there were tips for Stephen Hawking from a woman. It was good. Sorry, go ahead.
No worries. But I must say, it's my job today to be a sort of corrector, to judge, standing in the différence of the litige. But, let's say that we're also colleagues. Just take these remarks as questions to which I don't have an answer to, and we'll never get to the différence. Remain kindly in the litige.
Yes.
There's also a certain shyness, and some phrases to stick to the authors are lacking, as if you refuse to speak your mind. So what I'm trying to do is make you speak and question those silences. And my biggest remark today is whether or not you silence the author.
Okay. Yes.
Silence the
Yes.
author. So I'll come up with my example later on. But first of all, let's not forget the good stuff of the thesis, and that it's a work in progress. It's clear. I very much like the title, Open and Closed. There was some discussion about the earlier title, but this seems to convey exactly your point and why Wesley is there. I told you already, we're colleagues, so we converse down the hall, and I told you already, I like Wesley because, in a sense, what Wesley is saying, if I get it right, I learned a lot from your chapter on Wesley. That the human being is a sinner and he is not a sinner at the same time. But it's not the old traditional adagium like Simul Justus et Peccator, The salvation or the sanctification is not taken for granted as, Leotard would have made of theological tradition. It's a master narrative, everything is ready-made salvation. So he is a sinner, the human being, and he's not. So there's something to be done to earn or contribute to salvation. That's what I really like, One of my questions will be whether the stress on holiness is correct and not, whether or not it would have been better to use morality instead of holiness. I'll come to my question.